Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, with more than 40,000 dead and over 23 million impacted, the ongoing devastation of the February 6th earthquakes in Turkey and neighbouring Syria is growing. I travelled to two major cities in the region earlier in the week, and I'll shortly be bringing you some insights from information I uncovered while speaking with those on the ground. And the First Minister of Scotland announced on Wednesday that she'd be standing down, admitting that she had become a polarising figure and no longer had the energy to lead the campaign for independence. What does Nicola Sturgeon's resignation mean for the future of the United Kingdom? I'll be putting that question to our business correspondent Simon Pusey. Then later, we'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with a story that continues to make headlines here in the UK and across the world. As the situation on the ground moves from rescue to recovery, the UK is committing a further package of support to address urgent humanitarian needs in Turkey and Syria. The additional £25 million in overseas aid will fund additional emergency relief, such as tents and blankets for families made homeless in freezing conditions. Earlier this week, I travelled to Turkey's economic hub, Istanbul, where I met with some of the first responders at Doctors Worldwide and Islamic Help, who are working tirelessly to ensure that those who urgently need support are getting it. I later flew into the Turkish capital, Ankara, where I met with the Nigerian ambassador to Turkey, His Excellency Ismail Yusuf Aba, who gave me an update on the Nigerian diaspora community living in the affected regions.
We first heard about the disaster on the 6th of February, very early in the morning, as early as 5 a.m. And of course, as soon as we got to work, we reached out to our colleagues in the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs to get additional information. But by the time, before we even commenced our work for the day, we started hearing about the magnitude of the destruction, sheer loss of life and all that. So it was really a devastating experience, especially given the loss of lives, destruction in property, infrastructure, and injuries. We have a lot of Nigerians coming here for businesses, for tourism, for education, and incidentally, most of the people who were caught up in those areas, Adana and Gaziantep, were students essentially. And when the thing happened, we had close to 60 Nigerians there. But few days after search and rescue commenced, a lot of them left. Some came to Ankara on their own, and then of course some found their way to Istanbul. So as it stands today, we still have about 21 Nigerians who are out there who prefer to remain behind for one reason or the other. And then we're lucky that we have no fatalities on our side, either in terms of loss of lives or injuries. But of course, they are also affected by loss of properties, personal belongings, and all that.
That was His Excellency Ismail Yusuf Aba, the Nigerian ambassador to Turkey, with an update on Nigerian communities living in the affected regions. As of today, no Nigerian lives have been lost, yet our thoughts are with the over 40,000 people who have lost their lives in this unthinkable tragedy. For now, let's change gear to focus on the shock resignation of Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Like her or loathe her, Sturgeon will be remembered as one of the most impressive politicians of her generation, delivering a string of landslide election victories for the Scottish National Party. As she pointed out herself in her resignation speech, she has been campaigning for Scottish independence since she was a teenager in the 1980s.
Since my very first moments in the job, I have believed that part of serving well would be to know, almost instinctively, when the time is right to make way for someone else. And when that time came, to have the courage to do so, even if to many across the country and in my party, it might feel too soon. In my head and in my heart, I know that time is now. That it is right for me, for my party and for the country. And so today I am announcing my intention to step down as First Minister and leader of my party. I have asked the National Secretary of the SNP to begin the process of electing a new party leader, and I will remain in office until my successor is elected.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak paid tribute to her 8.5-year tenure.
Well, let me first start by paying tribute to Nicola Sturgeon for her long-standing public service, and I wish her well in the future. Now, obviously, Nicola and I didn't agree on everything, but in the short time that we did work together, I was pleased that we were able to announce 2 free ports in Scotland. That's joint working between the UK government and the Scottish government. Those free ports are going to attract investment and create jobs in Scotland, which is great, and I look forward to working with whoever the new First Minister is to continue working constructively to deliver for the people of Scotland.
Well, earlier I was joined in the studio by our business correspondent Simon Pusey for his assessment on Nicola Sturgeon's shock exit and what it could mean for this country's next general election. Simon, welcome back. I missed you.
Thank you.
Looking nice and brown. I've got to say, I'm rarely shocked these days when it comes to news, but when I got off the plane from Turkey, I was totally shocked to see that Nicola Sturgeon, after 8.5 years, bowed out. Like her all over, she clearly was a formidable leader, formidable female leader, although the former US President Donald Trump said good riddance to an extremist woke politician. What is the sentiment on the ground in the UK at the moment, and what does this spell for the next general election?
Yeah, so she's a real powerhouse, and she's a household name here, not just because of her personality, but also because she was leading the party that is going for independence, of course. So the real existence of the SNP is mainly, their main sort of remit is to make Scotland an independent country, independent of the rest of the UK. And so that's what they've been campaigning for, and that's what she's been beating the drum for. And I think people were quite shocked because there were no real mood music that she was going to step down. We've obviously seen Jacinda Ardern step down recently, and I think there are some parallels there. 2 women who are on the left side of politics and are real formidable people in themselves. But I think, she said it was personal reasons and that her heart was no longer completely in it, and it's a tough job. And of course, it's a very tough job. I think being a woman in politics, and especially leading a party and leading a province like Scotland, is very difficult. She had her critics, of course she did, Donald Trump being one of them. He has golf courses in Scotland, and they are coming with a completely different political spectrums. Alex Salmond called it an opportunity to reset independence. Alex Salmond, her predecessor. So I think people are interested as to what's going to happen next for the SNP. Which direction are they going to go in? There were various issues that maybe recently have kind of upset people that she took her stance on. For example, there's this gender reform bill, which is very, very controversial at the moment, and people saying maybe this is what really sort of tipped her over the edge. And then this de facto referendum that she is calling it, that is the next general election. If the SNP win a majority there, she is going to say that this is the Scottish people saying they want to be independent. So it's going to be really interesting to see who the next person is in charge of the SNP and what kind of strategy they go for in terms of gaining independence, because that is what this party is all about. It's about, a bit like the Brexit party. They wanted Brexit. They are campaigning for Scottish independence. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. But I think a big shock, because she's been there for 8 years and she's been a real powerhouse. She's been very vocal against Donald Trump, of course, but also against Boris Johnson. A real counterbalance to the Conservative governments that we've had in the UK for the last few decades, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next.
Just quickly, Simon, do you think Alex Salmond could make a comeback?
Well, they've been at the head of the SNP for the last 20 years or so.
They had a falling out, didn't they?
They had a big falling out. They were they were colleagues and friends for a long time, but I think they do take slightly different styles. One advisor who was working for both of them said he much preferred working for Nicola Sturgeon, who was much more pleasant, whereas Alex Salmond was much more combative. So there are rumours that he might make a comeback. But then there are some young people in the SNP as well. We're talking sort of early 30-year-olds who are also making waves. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. And also, like I said, the direction they take independence, because you remember from the referendum there was only a tiny majority that won the right to remain in the UK, and then we've gone through Brexit, which has completely tipped the balance really, and that's why the SNP are calling for another referendum. They called it once in a generation, but they're saying, well, actually, everything's changed now that we're out of Europe. We didn't vote to leave Europe, so it's going to be really interesting to see how they go about trying to get that second referendum.
Yeah, and of course, the Labour Party have lost votes, haven't they, in previous years because the SNP has gained so much strength. But is this under Nicola Sturgeon? Now she's gone, will the SNP turn to Labour, which could swing the victory in this election? Yeah,
exactly, and that all plays into it. The Labour were not winning any seats in the last few elections compared to the Conservatives, but the SNP were, so they were taking votes away from Labour. So that's another interesting dynamic. How does that work in the next general election? Will they continue to take seats away from Labour, or will they be less attractive because they no longer have this real force, this vocal force? It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's a shame to lose another female leader, but politics goes on. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.
Well, let's remain with British news, but pivot slightly to focus on the economy. Inflation fell by more than expected last month, and according to official data published by the Office for National Statistics, there are signs of cooling price pressures in parts of the economy watched closely by the Bank of England. Britain may have avoided a much-tipped recession at the end of last year, but economists still forecast significant headwinds ahead. One of those economists is Dr. Linda Yu, who joins me now from Oxford for more on this. Dr. Linda Yu, CBE, it's a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global today. Now, late last year, you wrote a short piece forecasting that 2023 will be characterised by economic uncertainty. I think myself and the audience pretty much know what your answer will be to this question, but are we seeing this play out so far this year in Britain?
Lovely to be here. And yes, unfortunately, we are. So what we have is almost like a 1970s type of recession. And by that, I mean it's characterized by high uncertainty because the recession in the UK is in part due to having very high energy prices and also commodity prices. It's what economists call a supply side shock. And why that creates additional uncertainty on top of a normal recession, if there's any such thing, is that the 1970s meant that it was very difficult for policymakers to anticipate what oil prices would be because they're determined globally. And it's exactly the same this time. So the UK is a very open economy for an advanced economy, meaning that 80% of the inflation in this country is imported. And so that means that when Russia invaded Ukraine this time last year, just about, it caused energy and commodity prices to spike. There were also issues around supply chain unwinding because there were issues with that from the pandemic. So these are global factors that make it hard to work out what inflation is going to be. And double-digit inflation, we haven't seen that since the late 70s, early 1980s. And so until you can have a sense as to where prices are going to go, then I think that would help determine what monetary policy, interest rates, which are geared at prices, are going to be. And then the fiscal response, meaning tax and spending policy to try to support the economy. All of those things are operating under the considerable uncertainty that a driving force of this recessionary pressure is out of the control of the British government. So that was what I was referring to last year. And that is indeed, I'm afraid, what we're also seeing this year.
Before I let you go, you are a very busy lady, and you've got a new book coming out titled The Great Crashes, Lessons from Global Meltdowns and How to Prevent Them. I think that's available in May. What advice would you give to the Prime Minister, who's slightly embattled at the moment?
Sure. I think in the interest of time, what I'll focus on is, how can countries learn from episodes of boom and bust that we have seen for centuries. And my book actually covers the last century, which unfortunately had quite a lot of boom and bust, not just in the UK, but in emerging markets and in advanced economies alike. So I think one of the enduring lessons is, there's always going to be boom and bust. So are you prepared for the boom? So in other words, during a recession, there's quite a lot of tendency to cut back on capital spending because that's one of the easier areas to cut. However, if you think about the opportunities for the UK economy and actually for many countries as well in the global economy, the green transition, digitalization, these are things that require investment today to have returns in the future.
Gosh, thank you for offering some optimism and hope. We need those opportunities and we need a boom pretty much now. Thank you so much, Dr. Linda Yu, CBE economist at Oxford University. Always a pleasure hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Coming up on Channel's Business Global, I'll be speaking with Mark Saba, the director of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, about the ongoing trial of high-profile pro-democracy activists in the region. And we'll be looking back at some of the biggest business news stories of the week. All of this after the break. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Mark Saba, the director of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, about the ongoing trial of high-profile pro-democracy activists in the region. But until then, here's Teniola Oyetayo with a breakdown of the biggest business news stories of the week.
British gas owner Centrica has posted huge profits after energy prices soared last year. Operating profits of £3.3 billion were recorded at the company, up from £948 million in 2021, and surpassing the firm's previous highest ever yearly profit of £2.7 billion posted in 2012. Profit at the oil and gas producer has been helped by high energy prices. Wholesale gas costs had risen to new highs following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Car maker Ford has revealed plans to cut 3,800 jobs in Europe over the next 3 years in an effort to streamline its operations as it deals with economic headwinds and increased competition in electric vehicles. The US car maker leads the European market for commercial vans, but has struggled to make strong profits from passenger cars and warned this month it would be very aggressive in reducing manufacturing and supply chain expenses this year. The company plans to cut around 2,300 roles in product development and administration in Germany, 1,300 in the UK, and 200 elsewhere across Europe. KPMG has announced it's cutting close to 2% of its workforce in the United States, becoming the first of the world's 4 biggest accountancy firms to slash jobs in the country. The firm says it needs to better align its workforce with current and anticipated demand in the market. Like other Big 4 firms, EY, Deloitte, and PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG has reportedly been struggling with the collapse in merger and acquisition activity, which has had a negative impact on its deal advisory business and ease in demand for IT and strategic consulting. Several financial firms have slashed jobs in recent months, including major Wall Street banks, asset managers, and fintechs, amid a turbulent macroeconomic environment. Teniola Oyetayo for Channel's Business Global.
Thanks, Tenny. Now, in case you may have missed it, Hong Kong's largest national security law trial opened last week with up to 47 of the city's most prominent pro-democracy activists facing life in prison. The trial has stirred difficult and complicated emotions within the small community of lawmakers and activists who were able to flee Hong Kong before they could be arrested. Western observers say the prosecutions marks the beginning of a new, more authoritarian era in Hong Kong, one in which political persecution will be used to strike fear in people so that few will consider protesting or challenging Beijing's authority again. For more on this, I'm now being joined by Mark Saba, the director of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Mark is joining me from here in the British capital. Mark Saba, thank you so much for joining me on Channel's Business Global. So the trial has commenced. It started last week for these pro-democracy activists, many of them facing life in prison. You know, this is a year-old story. Just for some of our viewers who haven't kept a breath of what's happening in Hong Kong, can you please provide more details about the case?
Yeah, so the trial of the 47 essentially is an attempt by the Hong Kong authorities, led by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, to destroy any attempts at a pro-democracy movement. What you do is you arrest people who take part in protests, you arrest people who hold up banners and placards, you put leaders of democracy campaigners in prison, and you charge them with all sorts of allegations of subversion or sedition or anything like that, and you throw people in prison. Essentially what we have going on now are show trials. Show trials, as everybody knows, are predetermined. Everybody knows what the outcome is going to be, but you have to give the semblance of some sort of trial. possibly to make the authorities feel better about themselves. Stalin had show trials. Chairman Mao had show trials. Even President Putin puts on show trials of people who stand against him. And what we're seeing in Hong Kong is 47 people, some of whom have already been detained for years. Most will receive extremely long sentences. For what? For attending civil rallies, demanding their rights for freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. And it's just a total crackdown and an attempt to break down the pro-democracy movement and to crack civil society.
Yes, quite frightening, actually, the fact that, they are facing life in prison. I think they're accused of breaking these national security laws, aren't they? We know what it's like living in the West, Mark. Attention is very short. A lot of people now focusing on Turkey. Are you concerned that we're not really having the same extensive media coverage about the trial as we did when we were looking at those shocking demonstration pictures over a year ago?
Well, I think it's the nature of the 24-hour news cycle is everyone moves on to the next news story. I mean, tomorrow something else happens in the world and people forget about Turkey. So I think that the world has not forgotten about the trial in Hong Kong for the simple reason that it's dragging on. And the other reason is simply that it's so egregious in a country that's spending so much time to try and attract foreign money. And foreign business and foreign investment. And if you're throwing people in prison while arranging a campaign called Hello Hong Kong, where you get people dancing and cheering on stage saying Hong Kong is open. Well, if you're a business and you're about to invest your money in Hong Kong and you're persuaded by dancers on a stage saying everything is normal, and on the same day you put 47 people on trial, there's got to be a bit of a problem there. So I don't think it's going to go away. I think there are a lot of people watching this. We know that the diplomatic community is watching it. We know that the State Department and Congress, people in Westminster are watching it, and other countries as well. So although it's not in the headlines today, I don't think this is a one-off story. It's not going away.
No, it's not going away anywhere, is it? But we do know that a couple, I believe 3 individuals have put in guilty pleas. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's more than 3. And the reason is simple. If you're made all sorts of promises, you'll get a shorter sentence, or we have evidence to confirm. And also there's coercion. And the people who've been arrested are regular citizens who, held up placards saying freedom now, or we want democracy, or no to communism, or whatever it is. If you're thrown in prison and your job, you're a nurse, or you're a teacher, or some average employee, you've lost your job, you lost your livelihood, your children are now at risk of maybe not having enough food or clothing or whatever it is, you will plead guilty to get out of prison. You just want it over, you want to get out to see your family. And some people fall for that coercion because they don't have the media attention or the coverage that some of the more prominent people have. And so it's a frightening experience to be thrown in prison on nonsense charges. Yes, of course, some people will plead guilty.
Yes, the Washington Post, I read an op-ed from them this morning, and the headline read, "Freedom itself is on trial in Hong Kong." I'm sure you agree with that.
That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I mean, it's not just about freedom of assembly and freedom of democracy. It's freedom of business. It's freedom of press. It's freedom of speech. It's freedom of thought. It's all the things which in mainland China over 50, 60, 70 years of the Communist Party in China have become normalized. For the people of Hong Kong, it's completely abnormal. And these trials are an attempt by the CCP to fully and totally integrate the Hong Kong mentality out of a democratic mindset into a communist Chinese party mindset. So democracy is absolutely at trial. And it's actually a trial for the West as well, for democratic nations all over the world. If you tolerate it, that a city like Hong Kong, which has tall, shining glass buildings, just like any major capital city, can be taken apart in the matter of 3 years by the introduction of a national security law, then other cities are absolutely at risk as well, because what's to stop that sort of thing happening in other countries with other authoritarian leaders? So democracy is absolutely on trial.
Absolutely. I don't know if you follow Nigerian politics at all, but we are facing an election next week. So I'm sure, lots of what you've been saying about freedom of press freedom of speech, democracy is going to be ringing in the bells for the millions of viewers that are watching right now. Thank you so much, Mark Saba, Director at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. We're certainly watching it closely on this channel. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for today. But as always, do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.